Winter, 1917. Orange, New Jersey. In a bright, clean workroom at a factory on Alden Street, a young woman lifts a fine camel hair brush to her mouth, draws it between her lips to sharpen the point, dips it into a small dish of pale paint, and touches the tip to the face of a watch. She is painting the number 6. The paint holds a trace of radium, and in a dark room, the number 6 will glow. She has been taught to do it exactly this way. Point the brush with your lips. Dip, paint. Do it again and again, several hundred times a day. The work is called dial painting. The women who do it are young, most of them between 14 and 20. They are hired for steady hands and good eyes, and they are paid by the dial, which means the fast ones earn more than their fathers. The room is warm. The pay is good. The paint is the most modern substance in the country, and they are proud to work with it. The company that hires them is the United States Radium Corporation. It makes a luminous paint, and it sells that paint to watchmakers and to the Army, because in 1917, the Army needs dials that soldiers can read in a trench at night. The paint has a trade name. It is called Undark. The word promises exactly what it does. In the dark, it shines. Here is the first thing to hold on to, because the whole story turns on it. The radium in that paint is what makes it glow, and the radium in that paint is what is going to kill the women painting with it. On the day she sharpens her first brush, no one in that room has told her those are the same thing. To understand why they were not told, you have to understand what radium was in 1917. It had been discovered less than 20 years earlier by Marie and Pierre Curie, and it had arrived not as a poison, but as a miracle. It glowed on its own, without heat, without a flame. It was rarer than gold and far more expensive, an ounce of it costing more than a fine house, and the world could not decide what to do with something that gave off light for free, so it decided that a thing that powerful must be good for you. Radium was sold in tonic water you could drink. It was pressed into face cream and toothpaste and bath salts, baked into chocolate, wound into wool for arthritis. In France, a whole line of cosmetics called Thau Radia promised a radiant complexion from a jar. Clinics advertised radium cures for high blood pressure and for aging and for a failing sex drive. There were radium suppositories sold to men who wanted their vigor back, and a gold-plated device called the radioendocrinator that a wealthy customer was told to wear against his body overnight. The message, everywhere, was the same. Radium was health. Radium was energy. Radium was the future, and the future was safe. One of the men who believed that was named Eben Byers. He was rich, he was a champion amateur golfer, and after an injury, a doctor put him on a radium tonic called Radithor, sold by a man named William Bailey as certified radioactive water, a cure for 100 complaints. Byers came to swear by it. He drank it for years, bottle after bottle, hundreds of them, convinced it made him well. It did the opposite. It settled in his bones the way it settled in the women's. His jaw failed. His body came apart. When he died in 1932, he had to be buried in a coffin lined with lead. A newspaper summed up his ending in a headline that has outlived almost everything else about him. The radium water worked fine, it said, until his jaw came off. His death did more than almost anything to end the fashion, because it proved, in a man the newspapers could not ignore, that the substance did not care how much you paid for it, or how sure you were that it was good for you. But that came later. In 1917, radium was still a miracle, and the miracle was on the tables in orange. So when a girl in orange asked whether the paint could hurt her, The answer she got was not a lie anyone in the room understood as a lie. She was told the paint was harmless. She was told, by some accounts, that it was good for her, that it would put color in her cheeks. The women trusted that. Why would they not? The most respected scientists in the world had put their names to the idea that this substance was a gift, and the glow was real. The dust of the paint settled on the women through the working day. It caught in their hair and on their clothes and on their skin. When they walked home in the evening, they could see it on themselves in a dark street. Some of them wore their good dresses to work so the fabric would shine at the dance that night. One of them painted her teeth with it before a date to smile at a boy in the dark. They thought it was beautiful. It was. Now the story shifts, and it shifts quietly, because that is how it actually happened. It did not begin with a scream, it began with a tooth. In 1922, a dial painter went to her dentist with a sore tooth that would not heal. When the dentist pulled it, the socket did not close. The bone beneath it had begun to die. He treated it, and the trouble spread to the next tooth, and the next, and to the jaw itself. Within months, the woman's lower jawbone had deteriorated so badly that a doctor was able to lift a piece of it out of her mouth with his fingers. She was in her early 20s. She died not long after. Her name was Molly Maggia, and she was one of the first to die. Her death in 1922 was written up on paper as the result of syphilis, a disease that carried deep shame and that blamed the dead woman for her own ruin rather than blaming the paint. It was a convenient diagnosis. It smeared her, and it protected the company in a single stroke. That record would matter years later, because it was false, and because the proof that it was false was still in the ground. She was not the only one. Across Orange, dial painters were coming to dentists and doctors with the same complaints. Teeth that loosened for no reason. Sockets that would not close. Jaws that ached and then broke. Some of the women developed problems in their legs and hips. Bones that fractured under ordinary weight. Spines that began to shorten and curve so that a grown woman lost inches of her height. The doctors treating them did not know what they were seeing. It did not look like any disease in the books. What was happening inside them was this. Radium behaves in the body much like calcium. The body cannot tell the difference. So the radium, the women swallowed off their brush tips, a tiny amount with every dial, did not pass through them. It went where calcium goes. It went into their bones and stayed there, and once it was there, it did not stop. Radium throws off what is called alpha radiation, a form so weak it cannot pass through a sheet of paper or even the outer layer of dead skin. Outside the body, it is nearly harmless. Locked inside living bone, it is the opposite of harmless, because there is nothing between it and the cells it is destroying. Day and night, for years, from the inside, it burned away the very bone that held it, and where it did not kill the bone outright, it corrupted it, seeding the growths that would later be diagnosed as cancer. The women were not being poisoned by something they touched. They were being poisoned by something they had become. For a long time, no one connected the sick women in Orange to the paint they used. The illnesses were scattered among different doctors, given different names. One young woman's death was recorded as a mouth infection. Another was blamed on a disease of the blood. And there was a second reason the connection stayed hidden, which is the part of the story that stops being an accident. The United States Radium Corporation had employees who knew, or should have known, that radium was dangerous long before the women did. The men who handled radium in the company's laboratory, the chemists and technicians, were given protection. They worked behind lead shields. They handled the material with tongs and with ivory-tipped instruments. They wore lead aprons. The scientists who studied radium in that period took precautions because they had already seen, in themselves and in each other, what it could do to skin and to flesh. The women in the painting studio, a short distance away in the same operation, were given none of that. No shields, no warnings. They were taught to put the brush in their mouths because pointing it with a cloth or with water-wasted paint and slowed them down, and the paint was expensive and the dials were counted. Hold those two rooms in your mind at the same time, because that contrast is the center of this story. In one room, trained men handled radium as if it were fire. In the other, young women were instructed to taste it several hundred times a day, and the company that ran both rooms would spend years insisting there was nothing in the paint that could hurt anyone. By the middle of the 1920s, the deaths in Orange had become too many to ignore. A statistician for the Prudential Insurance Company, Frederick Hoffman, studied the cluster of unusual deaths among former dial painters and, in 1925, laid the illnesses at the door of the radium in the paint. A dentist named Theodore Bloom, treating one of the ruined jaws, had already written a note describing the damage and calling it, almost in passing, a radium jaw. The name would stick. Piece by piece, from insurance ledgers and dental chairs, the outline of the truth was forming. The company, pressed to explain itself, hired experts of its own. In 1924, it brought in a Harvard physiologist named Cecil Drinker to study the plant. Drinker and his wife Catherine, a physician, walked the studio, tested the women, and were alarmed by what they found. The workers were anemic and sick. The building itself was contaminated, the dust so thick with radium that in a darkened room, the workers' hands and hair and clothing glowed. Drinker's report said plainly that the paint was the cause. What the company did with that report is the heart of the case against it. Its president took Drinker's findings and, in the version passed to the state authorities, turned them inside out, reporting that the women were in normal health. The one honest study the company had commissioned was buried, and its conclusion was reversed on its way out the door. There was also a doctor named Frederick Flynn who set himself up as an authority on radium and examined dial painters and told them they were in good health, in one case reassuring a woman who was already dying. Flynn was not the neutral specialist he appeared to be. He was being paid, quietly, by the industry whose paint he was clearing. When a company doctor examines the workers, finds them ruined, and pronounces them well, that is not medicine, it is defense. The proof that could not be argued with came from a man who refused to look away. His name was Harrison Martland, the medical examiner of Essex County, and he studied the dial painters when others were still calling their deaths a coincidence. Martland worked out how to measure what was inside a living person. He had them breathe into instruments and found that the very air they exhaled was radioactive, carrying the radon gas that radium gives off as it decays. He held photographic film against their bodies in the dark and let their own bones expose it, so that the skeleton printed its picture from within. He tested their breath, their bones, their bodies, and found radium in all of it, still active, still giving off radiation from within, still breaking them apart. For the first time, the illness had a proven cause with a name, and the name was the paint. Martland went further. In 1927, to settle the question for good, the body of Molly Maggia was exhumed, 5 years after she had been buried under a false diagnosis. The remains were tested. They were radioactive. The radium was still there, still measurable, years in the grave. It was proof that the paper had lied, that syphilis had never touched her, that the paint had killed her, and that whatever the company said, the evidence was written into her bones, where no lawyer could argue it away. The men who ran the company were not lining up to drink the tonic. They knew enough to keep their distance, while the paint stayed on the tables in the studio and the brushes kept going to the women's lips. This is where a name has to enter the story, because from here on, it is not a statistic. It is a person. Grace Fryer had gone to work as a dial painter in Orange in 1917, at 19, to help support her family during the war. She was good at the work, and she stayed for a few years, then left for a better job at a bank. She was healthy when she left. Then, sometime after, her teeth began to loosen. Her back began to ache. Over the following years, her health came apart in the way the others had. The teeth, the jaw, the spine that shortened until she needed a brace to sit upright and a second brace to hold her back straight. Grace Fryer decided to sue. That decision sounds simple. It was not. It took her 2 years just to find a lawyer willing to take the case, because the enemy was a wealthy corporation, because the science was new and hard to prove in a courtroom, and because a law that let a worker sue over this kind of injury barely existed yet. The clock was also against her in a way that was almost cruel. The law at the time set a short window in which a worker could bring a claim after exposure, 2 years in New Jersey, and for a disease that took 5 years or more to appear, that window had usually closed before the worker even knew she was sick. She found a lawyer at last, a young attorney named Raymond Berry, who took the case and did not let go, and 4 other women, all of them dial painters, all of them dying, joined her. The newspapers gave the 5 of them a name that stuck. They called them the Radium Girls, and they wrote about them as 5 young women already sentenced, doomed to die, counting out what time they had left in a courtroom. When the case came toward trial in 1928, the 5 women were in terrible condition. Some could not raise their arms high enough to take the oath. One could not lift her arm to be sworn in at all. They could not sit for long. Their lawyer had to work around bodies that were failing by the week, and the company's strategy, in part, appeared to rely on exactly that: delay the proceedings, ask for more time, argue that the deadline to sue had already passed. The longer the case took, the fewer plaintiffs there might be to see the end of it. The story of the Radium Girls became national news. The image of 5 young women, dying, too weak to lift their hands, suing a corporation that still insisted its paint was harmless, moved the public in a way the legal arguments alone never could. The famous scientist Marie Curie, asked about them from across the ocean, said there was no way to rid the body of the radium once it was in the bone. Under that pressure, and before a full verdict, the company agreed to settle. In 1928, each of the 5 women received a lump sum, an annual payment for as long as she lived, and the cost of her medical care. It was not justice in full. It was money given to women who did not have long to spend it, but it was an admission wrung out of a company that had spent years denying there was anything to admit, and it put the danger of radium in front of the entire country. That should have been the end. It was not, because the paint was still being used in another factory, in another state, where the same thing was already happening again. Move west to Ottawa, Illinois. There, a company called Radium Dial ran the same kind of studio, hired the same kind of young women, and taught the same method: lip, dip, paint. The women of Ottawa read about the New Jersey case in their newspapers, and they were reassured by their own employer that what had happened in New Jersey could not happen to them. Radium Dial even took out a notice in the local paper defending the safety of the work. Behind that public calm, the company had ordered medical tests of its own workers years earlier, tests that showed signs of radium in their bodies, and it had said nothing to the women the tests were run on. So the women of Ottawa kept painting. Some of them had followed the New Jersey case closely enough to ask their supervisors directly whether the paint was safe, and they were told that it was, that the trouble in the East had been something else, something that would not touch them. The answers they got back were reassuring. The answers they got back were not true. And a few years later, they began to sicken in exactly the same way. The same teeth, the same jaws, the same bones failing under ordinary weight. The women of Ottawa had watched the disease arrive in the newspapers a decade early, had asked the plain question, and had been talked out of the truth by the people who paid them. Among them was a woman named Catherine Wolfe Donahue. She had started at the studio as a young woman and worked there for years. When her health began to fail, she was let go because of it. Her employer had told her the work was safe, and now the work had made her unable to do it, and the same company that had reassured her showed her no mercy when she could no longer stand at the table. She and a small group of the other Ottawa women banded together to fight, and a Chicago newspaper gave them the name the country would remember them by. It called them the Society of the Living Dead. Catherine Donahue's fight came in the late 1930s, more than a decade after Grace Fryer's, and she was by then desperately ill. She weighed under 70 pounds. She could barely move. When the hearing came, she was too sick to travel to it, so part of the proceeding was carried into her own home and held at her bedside. There is a photograph from that period of Catherine Donahue holding a small piece of bone that had come loose from her jaw, wrapped and kept. She and the other Ottawa women pressed their case through hearing after hearing, appeal after appeal, against a company that fought them at every level. They won. The state commission ruled in the women's favor, and the ruling held against the company's appeals, one after another, until the highest court in the land declined to disturb it. It was one of the first times in American law that a worker successfully held an employer responsible for an occupational disease of this kind, a sickness that came not from a single accident, but from the slow, ordinary work the job required. Catherine Donahue did not live long after her victory. She died in 1938, in her 30s. Now step back from the two courtrooms and look at what those women actually changed, because this is the part that outlived every one of them. Before the Radium Girls, an American worker had almost no way to make an employer answer for a disease the job had caused. The law was built around accidents you could see, a fall, a machine, a fire. It had no real category for a poison that entered the body quietly and did its damage years later, after the worker had gone home for the last time. The companies had leaned on exactly that gap. The disease took so long to appear that the law had usually run out before anyone could sue. The dial painters forced that gap into the open. Their cases, and the public outrage behind them, pushed states to rewrite the time limits so that the clock on an occupational disease could start when the worker discovered it, not when the exposure ended. They pushed for the idea that there should be a limit on how much of a dangerous substance a worker could be made to take on. They helped establish the principle that a company has a duty to know what its own materials do to the people who handle them, to protect those people, and to tell them the truth. The safety rules that later governed radium, and that shaped how the country handled far more dangerous radioactive materials in the decades that followed, were built in part on what these women proved with their own broken bodies. There is a direct line from that painting studio in Orange to the safety standards that protected the workers who later built the atomic age. When the country began, in the 1940s, to handle radium and plutonium and the other bone-seeking metals of the bomb by the ton, the scientists who had to decide how much a human body could safely carry had almost no data to work from. They had one group, A physicist named Robley Evans and his colleagues studied the surviving dial painters closely, because the dial painters were the largest group of human beings who had ever taken radium into their bodies. And from what those women carried in their bones, the scientists set the first tolerance level, the amount of radioactive material a worker's body was permitted to hold. That number, drawn from the dial painters, went on to guard the health of the workers of the nuclear age. What was learned from their suffering was used to keep others from suffering the same way. That is not a comfort anyone would choose. It is simply true. Some of the dial painters lived for a long time. Radium works slowly, and a body can carry it for decades. A number of the women in Illinois and New Jersey survived into old age, and a research program later based at Argonne, outside Chicago, followed hundreds of them for the rest of their lives, measuring the radiation still coming from their bones, learning from them year after year. They agreed to be studied. Many of them understood that the measurements taken from their living bodies might spare someone else. Late in life, some of them set off the very instruments that scientists had built to detect radiation, from across a room, decades after they had last held a brush. And that is because of a number that never changes. Radium-226, the kind that was in the paint, has a half-life of about 1,600 years. A half-life is the time it takes for half of it to decay away. Half of it. Then, 1,600 years after that, half of what remains. The radium those women swallowed off their brushes in 1917 has, in the century since, barely begun to fade. It has lost almost none of its strength. It is still in their bones, and it is still doing what radium does, which leads to the fact that closes this story, and it is not a metaphor, it is a measurement. To learn from the dial painters after death, to understand the disease and to sharpen the standards that protect the living, researchers exhumed some of them decades after they were buried, with the consent of their families, and measured the remains. The bones of these women, 30 and 40 years in the ground, still gave off radiation. They could be detected. They will go on being detected for a very long time, longer than any nation now standing has existed. Longer than any name carved on the stones above them will remain legible. The women were told the paint was harmless. They were told it would put color in their cheeks. They wore it home so their dresses would shine in the dark. And they were right about one thing, the one thing no one ever disputed. The paint did glow. It glowed on their skin and in their hair and on the number 6 on a soldier's watch. It is glowing still. In their graves, the Radium Girls are radioactive.